Hi, and welcome to today's FYN Virtual Learning Series session. I am Joshua Frame, and I will be the moderator for today's session. I'm the National Chair of the Federal Youth Network. So today's segment is going to be a conversation about UX and human-centered design. Alors, en français, aujourd'hui, cette séance, ça va être par rapport à je m'excuse, je n'ai pas le mot en français pour la session d'aujourd'hui, mais je vais corriger cela quand on commence. Alors, cette séance, ça va être en anglais et puis en français. On va changer entre les deux pour chaque question et puis d'engager dans la langue de votre choix, s'il vous plaît. Alors, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez les poser en français dans le Q&A. Et puis en anglais, la même chose. So today's session will be in English and in French, so with a bilingual format. So we'll be changing between English and French questions as we go through today's webcast. I'll begin by acknowledging that I am joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. And I encourage all of you to think about which lands you are joining us from across Canada. And you'll see the link in your chat to find out if you do not know which traditional territory you are joining us from today. Au fur et à mesure que nous progressons dans la session d'aujourd'hui, veuillez partager vos questions en utilisant le bouton Q&A, malgré ce n'est pas en français avec Q et R, dans la langue de votre choix, comme j'ai mentionné. Alors, vous pouvez voter pour les questions que vous voulez poser en cliquant sur le bouton thumbs up. So using the Q&A, you can pose the questions you would like to have answered at the later part of our session for Jessica and Emma. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica and Emma for brief introductions, and then we'll get into the question period. So Emma, first over to you.
Hello, my name is Emma D'Souza. I currently work for the Canada School of Public Service. So our department provides learning opportunities for different departments in the federal public service. Prior to that, I went to OCAD University and studied industrial design. I've also worked in the jewelry design space for a little bit, in the nonprofit space for a little bit, and here I am now. So I'll pass it on to Jessica.
Parfait, merci beaucoup, Emma. Salut tout le monde, moi c'est Jessica Zeroual. Je suis la chef d'équipe dans l'équipe de Digital Engagement and Client Workstream, Client Data Workstream. Je suis désolée, je me souviens plus du titre en français. Alors, je travaille en Emploi et Développement social Canada, vraiment focalisé sur le design, vraiment focalisé sur les concepts qu'on va discuter aujourd'hui. J'ai travaillé la plupart de ma carrière jusqu'à date dans ce ministère ici parce que pour moi, une grande priorité, c'est de s'assurer que les services, les programmes et les politiques qu'on développe sont directement développés avec les Canadiens, mais aussi avec les personnes dans la fonction publique. Et sur cette note-là, je vais repasser la parole à Josh.
Merci beaucoup, Jessica. Alors, on va commencer avec la première question. So we'll start off with the first question of today's session. So to you, Emma, what is UX design?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm glad that we're starting with it because I think the word gets thrown around quite a bit, and it's a funny short form. So UX design stands for user experience design. I guess UE design was not as catchy. So that's the kind of origin of it. And I think the term came from about the 90s is when it first started being used a lot more. And it defines the user's interactions with the digital platforms that they engage with. So whether that's applications, websites, anything from a digital kind of capacity, and the experience that person has when engaging with that platform would be my definition of UX design.
Excellent. Thanks, Emma. Alors, Jessica, à vous. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est la conception centrée sur l'humain? J'espère que j'ai le terme correct, mais vous pouvez me corriger, s'il vous plaît.
Bon, non, c'est pas un problème du tout. Puis ces termes ici sont tellement nouveaux dans la fonction publique. Alors, tu sais, la conception de l'expérience d'utilisateur, qu'est-ce que Emma vient juste de décrire, c'est vraiment une méthodologie. Tu sais, c'est une façon de faire. Puis c'est vraiment une façon de faire spécifique dans la conception centrée sur l'humain. La conception centrée sur l'humain ou la conception axée sur l'humain, comme vous voulez le dire, c'est vraiment plus une approche, c'est un cadre. Alors, c'est vraiment une approche qui nous permet d'être capable d'aller directement aux utilisateurs. Alors, vos utilisateurs, que vous soyez en politique, dans les programmes ou dans les services, vous en avez. Que ce soit dans les processus ou dans les systèmes, vous en avez. Alors, cette approche-là vous permet d'aller directement à ces personnes-là pour non seulement essayer de trouver les idées et les solutions, mais de commencer le processus avec eux pour mieux comprendre leurs obstacles et leurs problèmes lorsque ça vient à qu'est-ce que vous essayez de développer, de changer ou de modifier. C'est un processus qui a 5 étapes. Alors, ça commence avec l'empathie, avec l'utilisateur. Ensuite, une fois que tu comprends les obstacles de ton utilisateur, tu peux mieux définir le problème directement avec eux. Alors, non seulement que tu définis le problème pour juste dire « voici le problème », mais vous expliquez le problème ainsi que les sentiments que l'utilisateur ressent dans le processus. Une fois que vous avez défini votre problème, on rentre dans votre partie préférée dans la fonction publique, puis ça, c'est vraiment de générer des solutions. Alors, c'est de générer autant d'idées que possible que l'utilisateur pourrait peut-être avoir dans le processus de mieux avoir accès à leurs services, à leurs programmes, aux politiques. Puis une fois que vous avez décidé l'idée que vous allez sélectionner, on fait du prototypage. Puis ça, c'est où est-ce qu'on amène l'idée à vie. Alors, tu peux faire des wireframes, tu peux utiliser des différents outils pour mettre votre idée à vie. Ensuite, la dernière étape, et c'est vraiment pas la dernière parce qu'il y a toujours une itération, ça veut dire qu'on modifie puis on met toujours en œuvre l'application du changement dans ton prototypage, c'est le testing. Alors, une fois que tu as un prototype, tu veux ramener ton prototype, ton idée à vie à ton utilisateur pour dire est-ce que c'est quelque chose que vous voulez utiliser? Est-ce qu'on s'est vraiment assuré que non seulement le produit fonctionne, mais que l'expérience autour de ça est vraiment convenable pour vous? Alors, c'est vraiment une approche qui est vraiment dédiée à mieux comprendre l'utilisateur by bringing them on the process. Alors, c'est ça la différence entre les deux concepts. Alors, la conception axée sur l'humain, c'est une approche, puis l'autre, c'est une méthodologie. Ça fait seulement une partie de la grande approche. I hope that was a good answer. I hope that explained the difference between both.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it did. Since we're sort of at the early stages of this webcast, I'm wondering if you could maybe repeat that in English for all of our participants as well.
Absolutely.
I would do a
Oh, is it just me or is he freezing up a little bit?
No, he's freezing.
Okay, then I'll just go ahead and explain it in English because I do think we have enough time. Yeah. Okay, so like I mentioned before, there's a difference between human-centered design and UX in the sense that they're not different in the sense that they're trying to work with the user. They're different in the approach, the fact that human-centered design is an approach, it's a practice, it's a mindset, as opposed to UX, it's a little bit more niche. It really is focusing on the technological aspect for the user itself. So it's usually bringing the user part of the process to kind of help you figure out the technological aspect that you're trying to modify, whether it's a product or service. It's usually web-based, it's usually technology-based. And human-centered approach is really focused on bringing the user along. And you have a 5-step process, which is very iterative, which means that you can be changing all along the way. But it really starts off with the first step, which is empathy building. So that is really just to better understand the user's barriers and their needs and their challenges. And by getting all that information and working directly with those who are going to be most affected by what you might be developing, you're going to actually have the information you need to define the problem. So by defining a problem, you're not just saying it doesn't work for them. You're describing it as it doesn't work for them. And by doing so, it causes frustration. It causes them to have issues with the system. It causes them. So you have almost like behavioral mindset almost frustrations that are underlying the issue itself. So you're really focusing on the user's experience all along the way. And then once you have a really good problem definition, we won't talk about how might we questions here, but once you have a good problem to solve, that's when you invite users and also people who might be in the process of working on this approach along to generate ideas. And you can generate any type of ideas. And I'm talking blue skies, those that you wouldn't even think would be on the table. And then once you select an idea that you actually want to move forward with, you move into prototyping. And prototyping is really fun because you bring your idea to life. And you can do it in various ways. There are so many tools for you to be able to bring your idea to life so that it's not just a concept on a paper, but rather a wireframe or a storyboard or role playing. There's so many different ways for you to bring to life what you might want to put in front of your users. And guess what? It's a lot cheaper than piloting. It's a lot faster because you're able to show something to your users and get immediate feedback. And that's when you're able to iterate, which brings me to the fifth step, which is testing. So once you have a prototype, you can always bring it back to users and just make sure that they can either test it themselves by you walking them through it. But sometimes if it's UX, sometimes they actually get to like click through the objects or click through the screen and see how the experience is for them. And they can provide you with the feedback right then and there. So again, the difference is, human-centered design is an approach. It's accessible to each and every one of you. So if you were to tell me, I work in policy, it doesn't relate to me, or I work in processes and systems, it doesn't relate to me, you always have a user. Now, when it comes to UX, it would really have to be something that it's more technologically focused. And that's when we bring experts. So experts are needed for UX, but human-centered design are something that you and I, all of us here in this virtual room can do today. So hopefully that gave a balance between the French and the English, Joss. I hope that was okay.
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks very much, Jessica. Awesome. Emma, over to you. So how often do public servants see UX in their daily work? Maybe without even really knowing that it is, user experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think public servants, both in the professional and non-professional context, come across UX on a daily basis. So in the personal side, your phone, every possible application that you use, every website, every interface that you use has been designed by someone, and they really can influence the way that you use those different services by the way that they design that first page that you see, the way that you navigate to the following functions that you'd like to access. Even though those things take seconds, those are really curated by the people who work for that company or for the government, depending on what you're interacting with. And I think from a professional side, public servants also come across UX design very frequently. It depends what technology we're given, and that really enables what work we can do. So we've all kind of come across the different platforms, whether it's pay or other functions like that help us in our own kind of work, where we can access these different platforms to get different things done. But I think that it's more of an emerging field for us to design in the context of Canadians, where we're focusing more on our program delivery and services and even policy of how those things intersect with design. And I think that's like a super exciting time right now that we're in.
Absolutely. Next question. Is there a role for UX or human-centered design thought or processes in every aspect of public service?
Dans mon opinion, oui, absolument. Ça, c'est juste parce qu'on a maintenant une approche puis une méthodologie qui nous permet d'amener nos utilisateurs, que ce soit les Canadiens ou que ce soit des employés ou que ce soit des personnes dans votre équipe. C'est surtout l'approche, la conception centrée sur l'humain. C'est vraiment une approche, c'est un mindset, c'est une mentalité. Alors, c'est vraiment une opportunité de faire un shift de, OK, au lieu de penser à des idées puis ensuite le mettre en œuvre, c'est vraiment de dire, OK, je vais travailler avec mes utilisateurs pour mieux comprendre s'ils ont besoin de quelque chose. Puis qu'est-ce qu'ils auraient besoin? Alors, c'est vraiment changer la façon que tu penses pour mieux donner à tes utilisateurs qu'est-ce qu'ils ont besoin. So for me, when I think about human-centered design, I think it really is a really great thing that we're integrating in the public service because it can be used across the board on anything that you're focusing on. So instead of making assumptions on what somebody might need, whether it's Canadians or your other public servants or your subordinates, you're going directly to them and you're involving them in the process, which is changing the empowerment, the accountability. When it comes to UX, yes, of course, wouldn't it be nice to be able to have platforms that are not only really great on the interface of doing things, so when you're using the technology, but the whole experience around it. So it really is an opportunity for us to go, oh, great, we have another tool in our toolbox, and this toolbox doesn't allow, this tool doesn't allow us to guess as much. It really focuses on us being able to bring those users along. And again, when I talk about users, for those who might not be working for the public necessarily, and they're maybe working internally like HR, or you're an administrative assistant, or you're working in procurement, you all have clients, you all have people that you work with, and you all have opportunities to make sure that what you're trying to deliver is really geared towards having the highest take up, the lowest problems, and really focusing on everybody having a really great experience. So yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Yeah, for sure. No, thinking of the HR processes, I feel like they could certainly use a long look at every process that you go through and whether it's been thought through from a human-centered design perspective, for sure. Emma, over to you. So how does human-centered design improve our outputs?
So that definitely links with Jessica was just mentioning, where human-centered design really allows us to incorporate users' thoughts from the beginning and try to co-design with them throughout the process. So instead of going along our whole journey and creating something, usually based on the assumptions of a couple of people, this really allows us to get their thoughts from the beginning. And I think people are also irrational. So a lot of the times what they say versus what they do are very different things. So I think that's the huge value of user testing as well, is they could say this is what we want, but when we test it really early on with very low stakes kind of prototypes, that can really inform the investment that we make in the long term, so that we're making much more informed decisions for whether it's for public servants or it's for Canadians. We're putting in huge investments into these programs and into these services. So it's really exciting to incorporate the users that would be using them in the end, because I think another huge theme in UX design is accessibility. And I think that's an emerging topic right now with how do we create more accessible services for the variety of people that we serve. So by including these variety of users from the beginning, we can really understand what the barriers are before the product or service is launched.
Emma, I want to make sure that I echo what you say in the fact that it's really important to go and test, because yes, sometimes at the beginning you do get some types of exaggeration. And that's what's really nice about having prototyping and testing, because you go back and you actually go, okay, I want you to be able to kind of go through this. And then you see whether or not it was just a desirability or it was a usability aspect that they really were talking about from the onset. And the thing that's really different between maybe consultations and also an approach like human-centered design is the fact that consultation, sometimes you interpret. And you don't have the luxury of having a prototype and bringing it to life and going back to your users all the time. So this approach really allows you, as somebody who's going to be using it, to stop and think, okay, am I interpreting anything here? Okay, I'm going to go do that validation exercise. I'm going to go see whether or not what we created here is something that is going to reduce those barriers or remove those barriers that they talked about from the onset. So again, it's not a foolproof. So it's not like you can just be like, okay, I'm going to use this approach and it's going to be foolproof and it's completely fine. It takes some diligence. And I think that it's really important that if you're going to take on a human-centered design approach, you actually try to find somebody who has already done it and bring them onto your team, or find yourself a mentor, somebody who's already done it in the GC who can say, hey, yes, you have really great activities, your workshop is awesome, but just make sure that you're able to go back to your users and show them your prototypes. so that you're not just doing the process halfway through. So there is a little bit of give and take when it comes to this process. And if I can default it, moi, je suis pas une personne qui a utilisé dans le design. Je suis quelqu'un qui a utilisé dans la recherche qualitative. Alors pour moi, quand j'ai été présenter la conception axée sur l'humain, j'ai pas réalisé que non seulement que ça l'aidait à ma recherche qualitative, ça m'aidait à peut-être pas interpréter qu'est-ce que les personnes allaient me dire, surtout dans un contexte d'entrevue ou lorsque je faisais des observations. So it really tries to minimize the interpretation aspect that sometimes, as analysts, as researchers, we're asked to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you sort of touched on this point in your last answer. Mais do I need to be an HCD expert to be able to use it? And are there learning products that will get me started? En français, est-ce que je dois être un expert pour utiliser ces concepts, ou est-ce qu'il y a des produits d'apprentissage qui me permettront de démarrer, de commencer mon parcours en utilisant ces concepts?
Oui, absolument. Alors, ça, c'est une très bonne question. Puis je suis certaine que beaucoup d'entre vous ici aujourd'hui, vous posez la question. Alors, pour moi, une experte en conception axée sur l'humain, c'est quelqu'un comme Emma. Elle a étudié en ça, puis ses habiletés sont différentes que les miennes. Moi, je suis quelqu'un que j'ai appris beaucoup à travers de la lecture, j'ai pris des bootcamps, il y a des cours sur Coursera que tu peux prendre gratuitement pour apprendre l'approche. Alors, c'est un peu des deux, tu sais, ça dépend vraiment qu'est-ce que tu essaies de faire dans ton équipe and how sophisticated it is. So like I mentioned before, for myself, I'm a qualitative researcher. I know ethnographic research. I know how to do different types of activities in that sense. And human-centered design is something that I had to take some courses on, and some are free and are available to you as well. Finding yourself a mentor is really important to be able to do the thing with somebody who has already done it before. Or sometimes you need an expert. Sometimes you need somebody like Emma who has studied in this and she's been able to learn the language and terminology and some of the sophisticated approaches that you would need somebody to kind of bring on your team. So for myself, somebody who has worked in the past in an innovation lab, I would typically know how to use the process in a government context and know who the users would be. So that's where I would have the strength. But then I would bring somebody who has that UX experience or who has more experience with some of the different tools and say, what's the best way for us to reach this group? And then you work together and it's a lot more powerful. So for myself, I don't want to be an expert in UX. I want to work with experts in UX. And that's when I think it's really important for teams to integrate that, but to also say, where does somebody who maybe has GC experience and needs to understand HCD work with somebody who is an expert in HCD or UX and work together? Because you don't want them to work in silos on your team. You want them to work in an integrated fashion so that they can share information and strategies together. Alors, c'est un peu d'apprentissage sur ton propre temps, mais je pense que Emma peut-être peut te donner un peu plus de spécifications sur les types de cours que tu veux prendre si tu veux devenir un expert, parce que ça, c'est toujours une option aussi. So Emma, I don't know about you. Do you have anything that you'd want to add to that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think something important to keep in mind is, like Jessica's experience, a lot of people don't come to design in, I'm trying to not compare it to another field, but like in engineering, you study it as a degree and then you go and do it, you go and work in that field. In design, I think there's such a diverse set of backgrounds that people come from. A lot of anthropologists, psychologists, a lot of different disciplines really complement the field really nicely. So I think one of the biggest important pieces of all of this is the creative confidence piece, where you get more comfortable doing the work as you do more of it. And like Jessica said, even getting a mentor or getting a little group of people who are in that same field is hugely invaluable. I've learned more from my peers in design than probably the degree. Maybe, it's just you learn so much faster with other people. And on the note of software, there's so many new softwares right now, like Figma, InVision, all of these kind of companies are trying to create these different prototyping softwares, and they actually have quite a bit of free online resources as well, because they want people to understand the value of this industry so that they can support it. So we might as well use the resources that they do give out, because they can provide really great articles as a 101 to some of these topics.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Emma. Thinking about a couple sort of past challenges in the GC that we've had in terms of internal services of, like Phoenix or the shared travel services launch. I'm sort of wondering if they utilized any of these concepts at the time, or what the situation would be like if they had, for sure. So Emma, how did you transition into the government of Canada, like with your skill set? How did you make that move and find a place to really apply your degree, apply your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't plan to end up in the government. So I was in my final year at OCAD for product design, and the degree was quite interesting because the first 2 years were much more traditional product design, like making things out of metal and plastic and very physical based kind of design. And then the final 2 years focused on more conceptual design with services, systems, applications, UX design. We kind of switched over to this more conceptual realm. And there's so much more possibility there, I feel like, because you're dealing more with ideas than with physical pieces. So that was a really exciting space to be in, and it really opens up the pathways of where you want to go from there. So I worked for a nonprofit for around a year, where we worked on a project for them that was involving a physical space, an application, and the overall strategy they had for serving their community with developing more of an understanding with digital media production. So that was really interesting because I didn't really think design could be applied in that capacity until I was experiencing it. And I was also working on a team with a bunch of other designers from different disciplines. So one of them was in environmental design and the other one was in digital futures. So she taught me a lot about AR, VR, all of the emerging technologies that are super interesting to learn about. So after that, I applied to this job for the Canada School of Public Service, and I didn't even really realize it was part of the government because I'd never heard of it. And I tried to search them on the internet, and there was a very brief Wikipedia page about them because it's an internal serving department. So if you're part of the public service, you would be benefiting from the resources that are developed. We have actually become much more open source now, where we're providing a lot more information to anyone who wants to access it. But at the time, I just didn't even know what it was. But it has such an amazing culture of learning and development. And I work on a team right now that is focused on transferable skills. So it has a heavy focus on skills that transfer within and outside of the government. So human-centered design is one of those skills for sure, and it's at the center of it. And this is a very long roundabout way to answer how I ended up in the government, but yeah, it's really cool because I didn't even know that design was being applied here, but it is being applied in so many different contexts. So there is much more of a community forming, I feel.
Absolutely. No, that's a very, very interesting journey, especially from, metal design to, designing products and services and helping people, figure out how to design services that will deliver to Canadians and to public servants, of course. So very, very interesting to see how that can kind of transfer for sure. So we have a number of questions in the Q&A, so we'll go to some of those. And as a reminder for our participants, please put your questions in the Q&A function and upvote the questions that you want to see. And we will pose those live to Emma and to Jessica. So the first, I think there's a tie for the top question. So the first question we'll ask. So qualitative data is so important to UX. So actually speaking with users. However, I've noticed people generally write off qualitative research as anecdotal evidence. How would you explain the importance of mixed research, quantitative and qualitative? Who would like to start with this one?
I don't know who asked that question, but what a great question and what an important one. I can definitely start, and Emma, feel free to chime on in. I'm really a big advocate for mixed method research. Yes, absolutely. Your numbers and your hard data are really important, but it's also important to pursue qualitative research. So when I think about quantitative research, especially in the government, I want you to ask yourself too, how are you capturing your data? How has it been designed for you to capture it? Whether it's a survey, whether it's administrative data, what is it truly capturing? How is it set up? Because that will allow you to see what your gaps are. And that will allow you to go pursue qualitative research with your users and ensure that you're actually getting information to fill in those gaps. Because there's a lot that you can't, like for me, if somebody was to give me quantitative data and say, hey, this is what you need to know, I would have so many questions surrounding, and I would hope that they would have done a qualitative approach. Now, if you use a human-centered design approach and you use a design approach through an empathy building exercise to generate your qualitative research, that's one way. But if you are using, we'll say, I don't know, user experience interviews, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, there are so many tools for you to be able to quantify your qualitative data. I am about to lose, I think Max QDA is a really good one. I'm trying to think of tools that I've used in the past, but there are qualitative tools that you're able to kind of organize and pull how many times, you know, somebody used the word, I don't know, banana, you know, in their interviews, you know, and you're going to say, oh, well, it's banana because of X, Y, and Z. It allows you to have a lot more why. And there's a lot of tools out there that you can use. It's whether or not you're equipped to use them. And there's a lot of really great tutorials, a lot of really great courses. But if we continue to rely only on quantitative, then we are more than likely not going to meet the needs of our users. So whether you're taking a more qualitative approach, traditional research methods, or using a human-centered design approach, it's really important to be able to bring that information to light and say it weighs just as much, if not sometimes more, than if you just look at the numbers themselves. So mixed method is the way to go. I definitely encourage people to use even just quant qual plus design thinking if you are doing a kind of full design project, if you're working on a really, really big priority and you have the time. But yeah, it's not anecdotal. I think it's the cop-out response to what people typically say when they think about qualitative. There's a lot of rigor that goes into qualitative researchers. And if you are somebody here who is a qualitative researcher, keep doing what you're doing and keep explaining the fact that it brings even more value to what we already know in our quantitative data. So Emma, I don't know if you want to add something to that, but I'm very clearly passionate about this, especially when people say that it's just anecdotal.
Yeah, I would definitely just say ditto for the mixed methods approach. And I think both of them have their benefits, but I have heard that as well, where the qualitative research or research gathered through human-centered design methods is discounted a little bit more as more verbal feedback from people for some reason is not held at the same level as more quantitative kind of research. So I think there is definitely room for both of them to exist. And I think that's a middle ground that people are more comfortable with than one or the other. So I definitely agree with what Jessica mentioned before.
And another example, as somebody who's worked a lot with multidisciplinary teams, behavioral insights. You're going to run an RCT. Great. Run it if you have no choice to do it before your qualitative research. But if you do a trial and then insert some qualitative opportunities for you to go talk to your users, especially if it's a letter take up or anything to do with a communication package, go talk to them, set up your trial again based on the evidence that you got and see if you see the difference. And I can tell you that from my experience as somebody who's worked in letter take up, it has been proven that being able to use human-centered design, being able to use qualitative research and qualitative data really does enhance your trials. It allows you to test different things because you're not just looking at who took up and who didn't, but the nuances as well. Is it the font? Is it, you know, the legal statement that's on there? Is it who it's coming from? So there's a lot of benefit of being able to do that mixed method.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Okay, so our next question, and I'll just say encore, pour partager vos questions dans les langues de votre choix, alors soit en anglais ou en français, en utilisant le bouton Q&A pour les questions et les réponses, et on va les poser dans la langue de votre choix. So the next top question we have, we are obliged to use a specific format for our websites. Has this design been tested through UX and or HCDE? And do you think there is enough latitude in that design to create a good user experience? So I think when we look at Canada.ca or these types of formats, obviously it's gotten very standardized. But what are your thoughts around this question? Has it been tested through UX, HCD, and just to acknowledge that none of us are Canada.ca experts, but your thoughts, Jessica.
Oh, c'est une vraiment bonne question, mais je pense que cette question précède mon arrivée au gouvernement fédéral. Alors, je suis pas certaine s'ils ont pris une approche qui est plus focalisée sur l'utilisateur. Je pense que peut-être que c'était plus web-based. Alors, des personnes qui travaillent dans la technologie informatique ont été les personnes qui ont potentiellement créé Canada.ca. So again, I think it predates Emma and I's arrival to the public service. But what I can tell you is, based on what we see, it is primarily formatted based on what somebody who might be working in IT, somebody who might be working in web design, as opposed to UX and UI. There's sometimes a difference that people need to understand how, web design, UX, UI, they all bring different values to the contribution of creating something for the user. And sometimes we remove UX and UI thinking it's a nice to have, when really it is like an integral part of creating your technology piece. But I don't know, Emma, I don't know if on your end you know more information, but I think it predates even more your arrival to government.
Yeah. All of my answers would just be based on assumptions that it went through, bilingual standards, spell check, the usual suspects, but I haven't heard of the actual kind of methods applied to evaluating it. So,
does it have an impact on how Canadians may be approaching some of our services, policies, and procedures? Probably. Do I think that there's an opportunity for us to be able to change that? I think people are working on that. I genuinely think so. When I think about the work that we're doing in the digital experience and client data workstream at ESDC for benefit delivery modernization, we're trying to push those standards. So I think that people are trying to put their best foot forward. But at the end of the day, Canada.ca formats and templates are the default.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, I think there's been a lot of improvement over the years. And certainly lots of the programs that we have in place now, like from, the title of those programs, thinking of, tax-free savings account and how it was a little bit of a boondoggle at the beginning with people, taking money in and out and having, being over their contribution limits, all this sort of stuff. But this is from my CRA background. But lots of these programs would be rethought if they were put through these kind of lenses now. So definitely interesting to see how that will sort of evolve in terms of how we reconfigure those programs in the future. The next question, I'm interested in the use of the term human-centered design in a GOC context. While many of our services are offered to Canadians, humans, well, hopefully all Canadians are humans, many other services are targeted at businesses or institutions or nonprofits or others. In that context, is there any emerging GOC consensus around the use of user design or service design or other terms instead of human-centered design?
Emma, do you want to start off on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think even inside and outside of government, it's hard to get consensus on these terms because they cover such a blanket of skills. So when it comes to human-centered design versus service design, and I think user design was possibly the other phrase, I've definitely seen more use of service design because I think that's easier for people who are not in the design field to comprehend. It's more, I feel like, visual to understand that there's a service in place and that there's someone who's thinking about each step of that service. And I think human-centered design has the same goal in mind and very similar methods in place, but I think it can be very intimidating on the scope to figure out what projects to apply it with sometimes. So I don't think there's kind of a term sheet anywhere where it's cut and dry. And related to roles, I think that there's also that emerging conversation of what are the traditional roles that existed from maybe the 80s or the 90s, and how are those transforming to reflect the current culture that exists and the current needs that exist. So what are your thoughts, Jessica?
Oh, I could not agree more. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the fact that the private sector is also reckoning with this. All sectors are, it's terminology, it's so new. And when I think about the concept themselves, I really do see human-centered design as, again, a framework, a mindset, a practice, as opposed to I see service design, experience design, UX, UI as methodologies to get there. And you're right, service design is more used because it's usually all encompassing of those things. It includes UI, it includes UX, it includes experience design. But human-centered design, if I was to hope what would be socialized, it would be that, because I almost want people to realize like human-centered design is everywhere. You have an opportunity to do it everywhere. You're working with businesses, great. Guess what works in businesses? Humans. So it's always understanding the fact that if you're going to socialize something and really try to familiarize yourself with something, it really is the concept, like the approach, the framework of human-centered design, the 5-step process, the importance of users, the importance of iteration. Sometimes if you are, and again, this doesn't go for everyone, but if you're somebody who is not going to be doing UX or UI personally, you want to be able to speak to the value of using those methodologies, but you can really force yourself to kind of just focus on the importance of human-centered design. That's where I would hope people would socialize it. Again, there's such a mix, and I think that that's why we are trying to understand where the value add is and when it comes into play. But yeah, if you can walk away from anything with something here today, is that human-centered design, I would not consider a methodology. I would consider more of a framework. And then I would consider service design, UX, and UI as your methodologies to get there, to really ensure that your experience for your users are maximized, whether it's around the technology or the service around it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Next question, where does accessibility come into play with UX? Alors, où est-ce que l'accessibilité, ça a une place dans l'expérience des utilisateurs? Et puis, and has it always been a consideration? I think the easy answer there is probably no. And the longer answer is it hopefully is now. Going into the future, how will each be leveraged in the public sector as well as private? So overall, accessibility, UX, what's the sort of interaction there?
You want me to start with this one?
Yes, okay. Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. So I think the word accessibility can mean a lot of things, so it can get pretty abstract, but in a UX context, if you've ever seen a poster or a screen with like neon background and then white font on top, that's not accessible. So things like that with like contrast, font size, it's very technical things, and there are standards in place for what is considered accessible, and those standards are definitely to be followed, especially by the government because of the people that we serve. So I think that those standards have been in place for a couple of years. I couldn't give the exact amount, and I think from the beginning it probably was not kept in mind based on the color schemes of the past. There's been some wild choices in mind, and using CMYK to the fullest, or yeah, no, that's printing RGB to the fullest. So I think it's an emerging discussion, and I think it really depends on who you're serving. But when it's such a variety, I think that's where it comes into place, where we need to speak to people more about what accessibility means to them, because that's their ability to be autonomous, whether it's in the virtual world or in the physical one. So I think there's a huge importance on that, and the ability people can have to live their daily lives depends on these services being more accessible. So I think that's definitely an emerging discussion, and I think the standards are probably going to be revisited from a couple of different perspectives in the coming years, just to understand what that looks like for things like voice technology and like all of these other emerging AR, VR, all those things, there would be a UX component to that. And so that'll be really crazy to see how those things all collaborate.
Absolutely. Jessica, anything to add?
No, I think that was really fantastic. If I can add one little thing to that really great answer that Emma just provided, is the fact that this is why it's important to go to your users and not always your easiest to reach users, because those who have the most barriers are most likely probably not at the table, because you need to do a lot of work in order to get to them. So if you're working with Canadians and you're working with certain populations, sometimes you need to find different avenues in order to bring those people to the table. Working with service organizations, working with your FPTs, working with your municipalities. And the reason for that is if you are designing for those groups that are the most barriered, that have the most obstacles, you are more than likely designing for everybody as well. And accessibility is really an opportunity to allow everybody to participate. You cannot be inclusive before you are accessible. So again, if you are going to do it, and I love to say it all the time when people ask me, the one thing they want to remember about the design is design at the margins. Don't cop out. Don't find just those people that are raising up their hands and those users that you know are going to give you information. Go to those who are not giving you information and that are going to benefit everyone in the long run as well. So that's all I'll add to that.
Absolutely. And Jessica, I think that speaks to your point about, you know, the qualitative research and the, you know, doing more sort of interviews and probing and, you know, finding better information about the services that you're trying to create and whether they work. Certainly in the accessibility field, there's a huge variety of users that need to be reached. And it's certainly more of a priority than it was, you know, say 3 to 5 years ago. And rightly so, because lots of these services didn't work for a good portion of Canadians who were trying to access them. So definitely some good improvements there, but some good philosophies that can be better applied to those design aspects. The next question: what makes for a great UX gig in government? And what do you look for in a team or project? Emma, maybe we'll start with you on this one. Alors, la question, c'est par rapport à l'emploi dans UX. Alors, c'est quoi qui fait un emploi comme intéressant dans cet domaine? Et puis, qu'est-ce que vous voulez trouver dans un projet ou dans une équipe? So, Emma, over to you.
So it relates back to a couple of questions we've had so far about distinguishing fields. So I think that, like we said, happening in the private and public sector, maybe at different paces, maybe at the same time. So it's hard to speak to what makes a great UX gig, because I think the box that fits in, it's still being kind of poked on the edges to see like, what is UX? Because in and out of the government, I've seen UX jobs that they want a unicorn essentially. So someone who will design the thing, test it with people and code it, and then, you know, do all of the things as one person. So maybe if you're working for a startup or in like a very specific context, that is a possibility, but that puts a lot of responsibility on one person's plate. And I feel like being the one designer on the team, you can often be looked at as the expert in that area, while you would possibly prefer to learn from colleagues at the same time. So I think that's harder to come by, though, is to have a team with multiple designers, because we're existing more in a multidisciplinary context, which can teach you so many different things about different fields very quickly. So I am currently in that context, and it's been really amazing as a learning experience. But I would say at the very least, a team that is open to learning more about design if they don't know anything about it, and they're open to encouraging you throughout that journey and open to supporting that process is very important, because otherwise you'll be in the role of explaining and advocating for design and its value while trying to complete the project. But that also is always a piece of it, probably. So yeah, what do you think, Jessica?
I think you have provided such a great answer, and I think it's so funny that you mentioned the unicorn. Maybe I'll put like a personal touch on it, since I've had a few opportunities in the GC doing this type of work. When I'm thinking about the type of gig, and I'm not a UX person, by the way. I like working with UX experts, UX designers, but for me, I'm more of a researcher who uses human-centered design and knows the value of all these different methodologies and experts in the process. So I would be looking for a team that is not looking for a unicorn. I'd be looking for a team where they would be ready to, as a team, take on this approach, really be able to say, we are going to be doing a human-centered design approach. Yes, we're bringing in designers, but we also know the value of better understanding how the organization currently works so that we know how to influence them and speak their language as they try to understand how we're taking on our approach. So I would be looking for a team where the multidisciplinary function is not like, you're the expert on this and you're the expert on that, but rather let's share so we can see how we can maximize not only the information that we have, but how we might use the approach to get the best outcomes and the best outputs. This is really tough to do. And if you are somebody who works in design, it's really asking questions about like, are you currently using human-centered design approach? How are you currently using it? What are the biggest challenges with decision makers and people in senior management? Because sometimes teams want to use human-centered design, they want to use UX, but it hasn't been filtered up that that's how they're going to do the thing. So I would encourage you to ask those questions, not to say, oh, I'm not coming here, but maybe ask the people who are looking to hire to ask those questions as well to their senior management and say, hey, are we actually going to take into consideration what we're going to ask Canadians to tell us in these design processes? Yes, okay, great. Then yes, we do have somebody who wants to come because they know that the value of their work is going to filter into the decision-making process. Now, are there going to be times that you put something in the queue and it doesn't work out and it doesn't get sent up to decision makers? Yeah, more than likely. But I think the more we use this process, the more people understand the value of it, and the more that we are working in an integrated fashion instead of a very siloed, you're doing this, I'm doing this, and we're not doing it together, the better it's going to be for people to find gigs and want to go to different types of teams. For myself, I love the fact that I'm working on serving Canadians from a service delivery standpoint. But if there was this type of opportunity, maybe at Environment Canada or at Transport, and the team was set up correctly, I'd probably go and try that out, even though it's not my passion piece. If I said this team is really set up for success and to actually do the thing, that would be really, really enticing. So again, I think we are at the very beginning of like what makes a really sweet human-centered design / UX opportunity in the GC.
Awesome. Looking back to a question in the chat around minimally viable products. So maybe we can talk about why that is an important concept, why that's an important stage, as opposed to the examples I mentioned. I think something like Phoenix or something like the shared travel services relaunch 5-6 years ago likely skipped this step, I think, in terms of their creation. But why is this minimally viable product really being bandied about a lot more in the government than it was a few years ago, and why is it an important step?
Emma, you just created a minimum viable product. Maybe you want to start off with that.
Yeah, the word is burned into my brain at this point from how often we use it. That's another word that I feel like is used in a lot of contexts, and then it kind of dilutes the meaning of it. So, but it is just the language. So minimum viable product, it's the kind of base of any kind of thing. For me, it was a course. So I've been working on a course that provides an introduction to human-centered design for the executive audience. And Jessica has been helping me facilitate, so she's awesome for that. But the minimum viable product in that context, it doesn't need to be polished and like looking the best aesthetically. It just needs to have the bare bones of functionality. So can this bring the person through what they could expect for the final product so that they could give feedback before you invest the rest of your time and resources into this final version. So I think it's kind of in the realm of prototyping, maybe near the ending of prototyping, where you've landed more of a perspective on what you want to complete and what the criteria is for your fill in the blank. And you're working on refining it and seeing if it's hitting the mark with users. So that would be my definition for minimum viable product. And I'd like to hear if Jessica has any views on it.
I don't want to add anything because you added, tu as vraiment dit tout ce qu'on est supposé dire sur le terme. So I'm not going to add anything else. I think that's a really, really good thing for people to hang on to as a definition.
Absolutely. Sounds good. So I think we are down to about 4 minutes. So we'll take one last question from the Q&A. This, I think, is a challenge that people often experience in a government context, but in a private sector context as well. So the question is, I'm a graphic designer, and we often have to work with really tight deadlines, which often means that some steps are being skipped in the creation of the projects. For example, user research. So what would be the best way to negotiate the deadlines with management if you know that in the long term it will be beneficial to have a final product that meets the user requirements instead of having to go back and fix the gaps after the final product is launched?
Maybe I'll start with this one, Emma, and you can add to that. I think this is something I often get as a question when people are looking to approach user research and apply the human-centered design. This is why it's really important, and this is why Emma's created a course for executives on understanding human-centered design at the executive level, at the decision-making level. I understand there's always emergencies. I understand things need to be done very quickly, but we need to understand what is their true timeline of rolling things out. Because there is time for us to be able to do user research, even if it is minimal, and doing some is better than doing none. So it's really being able to talk to those who are giving those commands to better understand, what is the actual timeline? What are we really rolling out here? And I think that that's a question that working level should start getting comfortable asking, but that management and senior management need to be comfortable hearing from their working level as well. And for those who are the managers who are trying to filter up and filter down, you are probably the one that is dealing with this the most, because you have a really frustrated staff that goes, I really don't know if this is going to resonate. And then you have senior management that says, I really need this out the door. So it's really having a conversation around why it's important to do it. What is the beneficial? And the added value is that you don't have to go back, or you don't have to create a function where you have to create like an FAQ page that is super, super long that nobody wants to read because you keep getting feedback that the information that's there is not helpful or not useful. So I think it needs to be a wider conversation. And I think one that if you are working, especially with like anything that's public facing, anything that's going to impact the lives of people, if you're not doing user research, you're playing with fire. You're playing a very dangerous game, and you're playing a game that you don't have to. Like, we have human-centered design approach. We have the ability to go talk to people. People are so much more willing to come and talk to us, which is going to be a great currency for us, which is trust. We're not dealing with people trying to buy into government. People are trying to build trust. And in order to do that, you need to put that buffer, which is being able to bring your users along and have them be part of it. So yeah, talk to your senior management and have those conversations, obviously when you're being asked to do something, but have those conversations when you're having strategic conversations as well about the work that you're doing. So really try to integrate it in a time where it's non-stressful as well. But yeah, very, very highly encourage, if you're a graphic designer, have that conversation with some of the deliverables you might be working on right now, and some that are probably coming into the queue for next fiscal. Emma, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say super quickly that anytime that there's project planning or strategic priority sessions, that's an amazing time, because I feel like they would be more open to hearing it. And another thing is, if you have any metrics that are evaluating the performance of your work, that could be another way to point to a symptom of the problem that you're looking at and show this is what we're hearing right now from the people using or receiving our services. And this indicates that it would be valuable to invest in this kind of work. So anytime that you have more logic-based, tangible things to point at, I think that's a really great place to start the conversation so that you're both looking at the same starting point.
Absolutely. Very, very interesting, interesting approaches and interesting ideas. Certainly in terms of the last question, if you have a potential audience of 37 million people who could be looking at this, trying to fix something after is definitely worse than taking the time you need up front. Even for internal services, if you have 300,000 public servants who are potentially accessing that information and then trying to fix it after is not a good plan. So thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you very much, Emma, for sharing your thoughts. Merci à Emma et puis à Jessica pour partager leurs pensées, leur expérience par rapport à cette séance. And thank you as well for everyone who joined today and for asking your questions. We had a ton of questions in the Q&A, and that was very interesting to see what your questions are in terms of human-centered design, in terms of UX. And thank you very much for joining us today. Our next sessions coming up on November 23rd is on being a tech-savvy public servant. And then on November 30th, we'll have a session on transferable skills. So expanding on our discussion today and the ways that you can really learn and develop your skill set in the GC and apply it to your own career development. Alors, merci à tout le monde pour nous joindre aujourd'hui. Et puis, j'espère que vous allez nous joindre la semaine prochaine pour notre prochaine séance. Et merci à Jessica, merci à Emma pour joindre comme les conférenciers aujourd'hui. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks very much. Merci beaucoup.